Thank you for the introduction. I am honored to be on a panel of this distinguished nature. I want to acknowledge Heartland Institute, first of all, for putting on this conference and for inviting me to talk. Also want to acknowledge my IT gal, who is also a judge in the Superior Court of my county. Her name is Judy Craddock, and she helped me with the PowerPoints for this talk. I've been interested in the health aspects of disasters and disaster threats for more than 30 years. And I've been thinking about the health effects of the supposed disaster of global warming intensively for the last 4 or 5 years. I talked about the health benefits of warming, much in the sense that my colleague Dr. Goklani has spoken of briefly
Are you going to do slides?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, my title slide's supposed to go on, sorry.
Do this thing here.
Okay.
Who's the geek?
F5. That doesn't work anything. Let's see if we go to escape. That goes to
Thanks.
there. And now we go to F.
I thought that the
No,
judge was
okay,
going to
good.
magically appear and start pushing the buttons.
Well, she could fix it too, but she's in court right now.
Yeah, okay.
This is just my title slide. You're not missing anything.
Go for it, Howard.
Okay. In 2009, I talked about the health risks of cooling, which are much greater. And I was going to not mention cooling at this conference because it's not a very public issue. However, we had 2 great talks at the Science 2 session earlier today when Dr. Abdusamatov and Dr. Don Easterbrook showed the high risk of warming in the next, even in our lifetimes possibly. Cooling, thank you very much. The current disaster which is coming on is the disaster of increased regulation by the EPA and increased taxation and economic damage due to the potential cap-and-trade legislation. Let's talk about the science that reflects on those questions. First of all, slide 1 is this is from an official document of the EPA. It's called Endangerment and Cause or Contribute Findings for Greenhouse Gases under Section 202A of the Clean Air Act. Basically, the EPA takes its authority from the Clean Air Act, which says that any substance or pollution that endangers the health of the American public gives the authority to the EPA to regulate those pollutants or substances. Those of us that have done research realize that you've got to read the fine print on anything, especially PhD theses and articles by climate scientists. So let's look at what the Clean Air Act says in terms of the Federal Register. This is the quotation from the Federal Register. The key points is that the administrator, you can read it yourself, shall by regulation prescribe standards applicable to the emission of any air pollutant from any class or classes of new motor vehicles or new motor vehicle engines, blah, 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 which cause or contribute to air pollution which may be responsible or anticipated to endanger the public health or welfare. Does warming endanger the public health and welfare? I claim on net, no. Let's get toward that question. The EPA issued an edict on December the 5th or December the 7th of last year about their proposals to regulate global warming, and they invited public comment. Many of us scrambled to get a comment into the EPA prior to the deadline. I got mine in. It was like 10 or 15 pages of data and argument and scientific input, and I never heard a word from them. I figured they threw it away or just didn't receive it, until I decided to check into that, and I looked over the EPA publications on this, in particular their response to public comments. And it's in several volumes. Volume 5 is the impacts and risks to the public health and welfare for human health and air quality. Okay. In this, there's about 25 pages on this specific question. My name does not appear in the section. The first 5 or 10 pages say that the primary data on the health effects of climate change, especially warming, should be obtained by death certificates from people who die in the summer from direct heat effects such as heat stroke, heat prostration, heat exhaustion, that sort of thing. They got comments that said that that's an underestimate of the number of heat deaths, that you should really consider all of the deaths that occur in a heat wave. Very few people mention the possibility of deaths from cold or from cold waves, but they finally admitted there are some deaths in cold waves too, but they threw out essentially all of the important data, and I'll show you how and why. Okay. The point to be understood here is that the primary cause of death from climate change and from climate in general for human beings is deaths in the winter due to cooling. And if you just include the deaths in the summer from heat waves, you're ignoring deaths which are much greater, as Indra referred to, than the deaths from the heat. The problem, though, is that the deaths from cooling are expressed as respiratory disease, such as pneumonia, heart disease or cardiovascular disease, such as myocardial infarction, and strokes, or cerebrovascular disease. And when somebody is pronounced dead from any of those causes, the doctor doesn't write died because it's winter or died because it's colder. The doctor just writes, pneumonia or MI or something like that. And so they did not count those data. So they ignored most of the deaths that are related to climate change. Okay. Furthermore, they ignored the most important body of data, which has been accumulated in the past 30 years, which is the data from Europe, which has been captured by British scientists by the name of Keating and his colleagues, and a group of physicians and scientists, epidemiologists. It was called the Eurowinter Group, and they were charged by the governments of Europe to look at the problem of deaths due to the cold in the winter in Europe. Okay. The mechanism of this is what the British call hemo concentration, or concentration of the blood, decrease in the blood volume so that there's less of the liquid portion and more of the semi-solid portions, such as red cells and platelets, for example. What happens when the blood becomes more concentrated and you lose the volume? You get sludging. The blood becomes thicker. We would call it, in America, we'd call it more viscous. And they actually have measurements in other papers of the actual viscosity of the blood as it increases as a function of the ambient temperature going down. Okay. So let's look at some of the data on health effects of climate change directly. First of all, we'll dispose of the indirect effects of climate change with a brilliant graph that was published some years ago by Dr. Goklani. Let's see if it comes up. Okay. This is uncontroversial data from Dr. Goklani's book, let's see, The State of the World, Improving State of the World, published by Cato Press. And this is a graph of the United States deaths and death rates from all the indirect causes which Al Gore claims are going to increase as the temperature warms. Tornadoes, floods, lightning, hurricanes, and extreme temperatures. Those are the extreme weather events which are supposed to go higher as CO2 increases. What's actually happening to those events and the deaths that they are supposed to cause? If you can see the trend, it's obvious. It's a steady downward trend from 1978, when the warming period supposedly started, through 2003, and as you know, the warmest year of the warming trend was 1998, which coincidentally was El Nino. So the indirect claim, the claim of deaths due to indirect climate events is entirely spurious. Okay, now I'm going to concentrate on direct deaths due to all kinds of diseases. Okay, in particular, this is British data. This is a very fine report that was done, it was published in 2008 by the United Kingdom. It's called Health Effects of Climate Change in the United Kingdom, 2008. The editor is Sari Kovacs, who is a good scientist. And the net result of this is their conclusion that if the climate continues to change in the warming trend, we expect less overall deaths in the United Kingdom. So they answered the EPA's question right off the bat, and for England, or for the UK rather, and that is that as the climate warms, according to the warming that the UK has experienced in the past 25 years, fewer people will die. That should have been enough for the EPA. What did they say? We looked at it. It's Britain. It's not relevant for the United States, as if human beings in Britain are much more sensitive or much less sensitive to the temperature and the weather than American citizens. It's absurd that they've ignored this data. Okay. All right. Continuing in the same vein, I'm sorry, this is the same graph that Dr. Goklani showed. I'm going to dwell on it a little more in terms of the fine structure of the graph. This is from a group of Greek physicians headed by a fellow named Falagos, and it's published in the CMA journal about 3 months ago. I just heard about it recently. It's better than some of the data that I was using in prior talks. What it shows is an assembly of mortality rates as a function of the month of the year for about 10 or 11 different countries. You can see the ordinate is mortality as a percentage of the yearly average, so it's normalized to the yearly average for that country, and it's the months starting January through December. When I first saw it, I thought, oh my God, there's a major contradiction here. This is Australia and New Zealand. For Australia and New Zealand, this is the winter. So the data stands. The mortality rate in the winter, expressed by this peak here, and this peak here, and this peak here for the southern hemisphere, is way higher than the mortality rate in the summer. There's an interesting little data set right here for the island of Cyprus. Cyprus is interesting because it follows the general trend. I'm going to ignore this peak as explained in the paper, but the main point of this is that Cyprus represents an underdeveloped country. The rest of these countries are all developed countries, and they're on 4 different continents: North America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania. So this is not just representative of one country, it's representative of the entire developed world. Cyprus is less developed, and if you claim that it's socioeconomic status or development that determines this, you're wrong. They follow the same slope. All of the countries of the world that we have data on have the same slope because we have the same species of human beings, Homo sapiens, all over the world, and they all respond to temperature change and seasonal climates in the same way. This entirely denies some of the basic operating hypotheses of the Environmental Protection Administration, people who did this report. They claim, they say the administrator found, that's Lisa Jackson. Obviously, she read over all the papers herself. That's a joke. Okay. Finally, my favorite data set, because I have background in engineering and physics, is a data that has a slope to it so that I can calculate trends. This is the Eurowinter data, and it looks at 3 different kinds of mortality. I can't read it from here. You can. Oh, sorry. IHD at the top is ischemic heart disease. That's myocardial infarction, heart attacks. CVD is not cardiovascular, it's cerebrovascular. That's the British usage. And then at the bottom is RD, which is respiratory disease. And then there's death from all causes at the bottom. And these are the extremes of the European climate. On one side is Athens, so that's the southernmost part of Europe with the hottest normal climate. And this is Helsinki, Finland. And the point is all of the data have the same form. They all show a steady downward slope in mortality as the temperature increases. So if you want to make a calculation of the effect of warming, you've got a slope in terms of increased mortality as a percentage as a function per degree centigrade. So I've looked at this, and I didn't draw these slopes. These were drawn by the Eurowinter group. They did not have an axe to grind. The slope is such that an increase of temperature of 1 degree centigrade, and the slopes are not exactly the same. They're similar but not the same. As you increase the temperature by 1 degree centigrade, there is a 1 to 2% drop, with 2% being the best central number in the mortality rate for most of this range of all of these measurements, which are year-round, not just in heat waves and cold snaps. There are vulnerable groups. As you might have guessed, the elderly are more vulnerable, and the mortality decreases by 3% for every 1 degree of centigrade temperature increase. Okay. If you extrapolate this to the population of the United States, which is what EPA is supposed to be talking about, this means that if the IPCC estimates of a 4-degree temperature rise by the year 2100 are true, and you assume a linear temperature increase, thank you, you will prevent 5 to 10 million deaths per year. If you multiply times the population of the world relative to the population of the United States, you get 170 million deaths in the world would be prevented by the year 2100. This is very nice because it agrees with Bjorn Lomborg's calculation in his book Cool It. As you know, Bjorn Lomborg is a very distinguished environmental economist, and he actually accepts the anthropogenic hypothesis, but he's going around the world giving speeches that we shouldn't do stupid things like cap and trade. Okay. I have more on the specific sidelights of the mechanisms here, but I'm going to just read my conclusions. The EPA should not regulate carbon dioxide. There is no mandate from the Clean Air Act because warming and increasing CO2 would result in more benefit than harm. Second of all, if you regulate carbon dioxide, what will it do? It will increase the cost of all fuels, especially heating oil. What happens when you increase the cost of heating oil by a factor of 2, for example, which is envisioned in some of Obama's presentations? Poor people will have to spend less on heating oil or stop heating on some of the worst days of the year, and more poor people will die of the cold in winter. I owed a vote of thanks to Jane Orient for pointing this out for me. I'm going to call this the Orient Theorem. Second of all, paradoxically, increasing CO2 regulation will increase the cost of energy, and therefore electricity will go up, and people will use less air conditioning in the summer, and more people will die from the cold. For exactly the same reasons, cap and trade will be harmful to the health of Americans, and furthermore, it will decrease longevity. What most people do not realize is that deaths from heat are often elderly people who are already weakened by disease or chronic problems of another type, and when they die a day or a week earlier than they would have died ordinarily. So you lose a day or a week of lifespan. Whereas heart attack deaths and stroke disability occurs when there's 10 or 20 or sometimes 30 years of lifespan left, and you are either destroying a life and losing 20 or 30 years, or making a life of extreme expense and misery for the person affected. So the effect on health is much greater than these ratio of the death rates. Another corollary, if natural forces influence climate more than anthropogenic gases, both programs, cap and trade and EPA regulation, will be of very minimal benefit or no benefit and at very great cost, not just in dollars but in health. Finally, this is my corollary to Dr. Orient's theorem. Any government program that increases energy costs will increase mortality rates. It will decrease both lifespan and the quality of life. I sometimes wonder if that's the reason why the environmental extremists want those programs to come to pass. Thank you very much for your attention.